Marx's Increasing Misery Doctrine by Thomas Sowell, published in the American Economic Review in 1960. Economists often assume as almost self-evident that Karl Marx's prediction of ever-increasing misery for the workers under capitalism refers to a decline in the amount of goods and services they will receive. Some writers have implied that only the intellectually dishonest could deny this view. It is readily inferred that the interpretation of Marx to mean a decline in labor's relative share is only an afterthought of latter-day Marxists seeking to salvage something from the ruins of the prediction. While labor's relative share has not declined, this at least has the dignity of a plausible prediction which went unfulfilled, while a theory of absolute misery would be thoroughly discredited by history. That some consideration of this sort has in fact provided the subjective motivation for some statements on this point by latter-day Marxists is probable. But to say that this is the only possible basis for the relative misery interpretation is something very different. It will be argued here that relative misery was precisely what Marx's prediction referred to, insofar as it was concerned with the purely economic aspect of the worker's condition. It will be further argued that Marx was not solely concerned with this aspect. Standard argument against the relative misery interpretation is that while, quote, some passages in Marx bear interpretation in this sense, this clearly violates the meaning of most, unquote. In order to avoid this charge, the argument that follows will not cite passages from Marx which, quote, bear interpretation, unquote, as relative misery, but only such passages as bear interpretation in no other way. This argument, however, will not be simply a passage quoting one, but will attempt to show how the substantive meaning of Marx's increasing misery prediction turns in part on the Marxian conception of the value of wages, which depends in turn on the whole value framework of Marxian economics, derived from Ricardian economics, whose particular conceptual framework caused similar misunderstandings of Ricardo long before Marx wrote Capital. It will be shown that Marx was fully aware of Ricardo's peculiar conception of the value of wages and explicitly endorsed it. In addition to exploring one, the meaning of the value of wages in Ricardian Marxian terms, and especially the meaning of a rise or a fall of wages in such terms, it will be necessary to consider two, or second, the meaning of Marxian, quote, subsistence, unquote, and its relevance here, as well as third, some of the arguments used to support the absolute misery interpretation, and fourth, the non-economic dimension of Marxian, quote, misery, unquote. Section 1. The value of wages. Conventional economic theory has long made a distinction between the amount of money which the worker receives as wages and the amount of goods and services which this money will buy. Adam Smith spoke of real wages, quote, and nominal wages in this sense. David Ricardo, from which much of Marx's economic apparatus is derived, also used the terms real wages and nominal wages, but because of the nature of his particular system, they meant something very different. What Adam Smith and other economists called real wages was included under nominal wages by Ricardo. Real wages in Ricardo's terminology meant the value of wages, that is, the amount of labor contained in the commodities which the worker received. Ricardian real wages measured the degree to which the workers shared in total output, not the absolute amount of goods and services which they received. If, due to increased productivity, the workers should receive a greater quantity of goods representing a smaller share of output, then in Ricardian terms, wages would have fallen. Ricardo declared that, quote, it will not the less be a real fall because they might furnish him with a greater quantity of cheap commodities than his former wages, unquote. Marx follows this same line of reasoning in the following quote, it is possible with an increasing productiveness of labor for the price of labor power to keep on falling and yet this fall to be accompanied by a constant growth in the mass of the laborer's means of subsistence, unquote. More important than such parallel statements is the fact that Marx saw the peculiarity of the Ricardian conception of wages and deliberately made it his own, not simply as an accidental byproduct of using Ricardo's so-called labor theory of value, but because he, that is Marx, felt that there was a valid social philosophy implicit in this conception. Uh, for example, listen to the following quote. The value of wages has to be reckoned not on the basis of the quantity of necessaries which the worker receives, but on the basis of the quantity of labor which these necessaries costs. Actually, the proportion of the working day which he appropriates for himself. It is possible that, reckoned in use value, parenthetical note, quantity of commodities or money, uh, end of parenthetical, his wages may rise as productivity increases, and yet reckoned in value they may fall. It is one of Ricardo's greatest merits that he made an examination of relative wages and established them as a definite category. Previously, wages had always been looked upon as a simple element, and consequently the worker had been regarded as an animal. In Ricardo, however, he is considered in his social relationship. The position of the classes in relation to each other depends to a greater extent on the proportion which the wage forms than on the absolute amount of the wage. End of long quote from Marx. Back to Thomas Sowell. Marx seemed particularly concerned to emphasize the relative share approach because of the economic prerequisites of increased wages under capitalism. Another quote from Marx. A noticeable increase in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. The rapid growth of productive capital brings about an equally rapid growth of wealth, luxury, social needs, and social enjoyments. Thus, although the enjoyments of the worker have risen, the social satisfaction that they give has fallen in comparison with the state of development of society in general. Our needs and enjoyments spring from society. We measure them therefore by society and not by the objects which serve for their satisfaction. Because they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. End of the long quote. Back to Thomas Sowell. But while it is clear that Marx regarded a relative decline in wages as a real fall in wages, this does not dispose of the possibility that he may have, in addition, felt that real wages in the conventional sense would also fall over time under capitalism. And in fact, the evidence seems to indicate that at an early period in his writings, probably up through the time of the Communist Manifesto published in 1848, he did in fact believe that the absolute impoverishment would be the lot of the working class under capitalism. The manifesto flatly declares the quote, the modern laborer, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class, unquote. Marx's unfinished manuscripts of this period also seem to suggest a belief in either stable or declining real wages. Parenthetical note, again, in the conventional sense, end of parenthetical. All of this, however, was written before Marx's long years of study in the British Museum and also at a time, the hungry 1840s, when in fact the standard of living of workers seemed to be either unchanging or deteriorating. Between this period in the 1840s and the publication of the first volume of Capital in 1867, German socialists and communists put forth the so-called quote, iron law of wages, unquote, which declared that wages could not rise under capitalism. Some latter day critics have attempted to associate Marx with this iron law. But in fact, Marx heaped scorn and ridicule on it in his critique of the Gotha program in 1875. Significantly, he characterized it as a view that was now outmoded and constituted an outrageous retrogression in the light of recent, more scientific understanding of wages. Engels was less indirect in referring to the publication of the first volume of Capital, which, he declared, now showed that the laws of wages are, quote, in no sense iron, but on the contrary very elastic, unquote, in contrast to the antiquated economic view represented by Lassalle's iron law. These vague and oblique references to antiquated ideas and retrogression only hinted at what Engels was later to state openly, that Lassalle's iron law was derived from his and Marx's writings of the 1840s and represented views now discarded by them. From the point of view of the developed Marxian theories, Lassalle's iron law represented not merely a false statement, but more importantly, a false issue.
It was the exploitation of the worker that was the central issue to Marx, who declared that this exploitation must grow worse, regardless of whether wages go up or down. Quote, "The wage worker has permission to work for his own life, i.e., to live, only insofar as he works for a certain time gratis for the capitalist. Consequently, the system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment." Emphasis added. It is as if among slaves who have at last got behind the secret of slavery and broken out in rebellion, a slave still in thrall to obsolete notions were to inscribe on the program of the rebellion, subquote, "Slavery must be abolished because the upkeep of slaves in the system of slavery cannot exceed a certain low maximum," end of quote. The idea, back to Sowell, the idea that increasing misery accompanies the growth of capitalism, quote, "whether the worker receives better or worse payment," unquote, occurs also in Das Kapital, where Marx declares that, quote, "in proportion as capital accumulates, the lot of the laborer, be his payment high or low, must grow worse," unquote. Back to Sowell. In fact, this statement occurs in the very same paragraph as that statement so often quoted to support the interpretation of the, quote, "absolute misery," unquote, school. Quote, "Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole," unquote. Back to Sowell. This and similar statements do not support either interpretation, since it is precisely the meaning of such statements which is at issue. Section 2. Subsistence. An increasing misery which can occur in spite of increasing wages, in the ordinary sense, does not, however, preclude decreasing wages. Neither does the definition of rises and falls in relative terms of itself preclude absolute misery, since relative misery carried beyond a certain point would also be absolute misery. In order to see what limits, if any, Marx assigned to this relative misery, some consideration of Marxian subsistence is required. Marx's subsistence has sometimes been regarded as being minimum physical subsistence, or something very close to it, or at least something fixed at a definite level. Some writers have extended this idea to mean that Marx assumes a subsistence level toward which wages might tend to fall over time. But this particular theory is entirely absent from Marx and his writings. There is not a secular tendency for wages to fall to subsistence. Rather, workers tend to be at subsistence. But the content of this subsistence changes, consisting as it does of both natural wants and so-called necessary wants, which are the product of historical development. However, one might object to Marx's and other economists' use of subsistence in this sense. The substance of his meaning is plain. The value of a worker's labor power is that value or embodied labor required for the conservation and reproduction of his labor power, regardless of whether the conditions of this conservation and reproduction are scanty or bountiful, favorable or unfavorable. It is end of quote. It is back to Sowell. It is sometimes claimed that a wage level fixed at subsistence, in the ordinary sense, is a necessary condition for Marx's theory of surplus value. But in fact, it is only necessary to show a difference between the output of labor and the output required to sustain the laborer. Marx's picture of the worker at subsistence, therefore, does not preclude the increases in real wages in the conventional sense. Once a new, higher standard of living becomes established, it too becomes subsistence and represents the new value of labor power, i.e., the real wage level. Marx does not have a determinate theory of wages. How labor shares in the increasing productivity is a matter of bargaining power. It depends on the relative weight which the pressure of capital on one side and the resistance of the laborer on the other side throws into the scale. End of quote. The Ricardian Marxian conception is here manifested in the word resistance. The worker is resisting a fall in wages, although Marx declares that the lowest limit of this fall is a wage which will purchase the former sum of commodities. If wages fall to any point above the lowest possible point consistent with its new value, then despite this fall, this lower price would represent an increased mass of necessaries. Marx credits Ricardo with the original formulation of this law. Far from being a law of increasing misery in the conventional sense, it represents a law of a customary floor under wages which would prevent such an occurrence. A crucial but unstated assumption in Marx's increasing misery doctrine is that the workers themselves will judge wage movements from this relative point of view. Otherwise, Marxian misery, when accompanied by material prosperity, need never provoke revolution. Another assumption in both Marxian and Ricardian illustrations is a falling price level with increased productivity, so that it is meaningful for them to speak of a fall in wages in money terms as well as in value terms, and to speak of a cheapening of commodities. Section 3. Arguments for the absolute misery interpretation. It is sometimes asserted that Marx's theory was that increasing productivity with the same capital labor ratio would raise wages, but that capital intensive, that is, labor saving growth, tended to decrease wages by causing technological unemployment, with the reserve army of the unemployed, as he put it, dragging down wages. This is true as long as it is kept in mind that wage movements are in value terms and may be said to fall in money terms only on the Ricardian Marxian assumption of increasing purchasing power of money with growing productivity. Moreover, capital-intensive growth introduced an element of absolute misery for those particular workers displaced by new technology. Marx brings this point in against those who argue a necessary connection between the growth of capital and the material well-being of the worker. He is further concerned to explode the contention that this is only a temporary inconvenience by asserting that, quote, since machinery is continually seizing upon new fields of production, its temporary effect is really permanent. End of quote. Back to Sowell. Capital-intensive growth for Marx not only deprives the worker of his rightful share of increasing productivity by lowering his ability to resist the capitalists' encroachments, it causes an absolute decline in living standards for those displaced by machinery. Marx's theory of the growth of what he calls official pauperism is sometimes cited as an argument for the absolute misery interpretation. However, as Marx defines his terms, official pauperism covers those no longer in the labor force. That is, quote, that part of the working class which has forfeited its condition of existence, the sale of its labor power, that is, and vegetates upon public alms. End of quote. Back to Sowell. The view that this group will tend to increase within the growth of capitalism is not the same thing as a theory of increasing absolute misery for the working class as a whole. And in fact, is only a small part of Marx's picture. Marx often speaks of a tendency of capitalists or capitalism to reduce wages in terms which suggest absolute impoverishment. The other side of Marx's coin, however, is the counter tendency of the workers to increase wages as much as possible. He speaks of, quote, the continuous struggle between capital and labor, the capitalist constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the working man constantly presses in the opposite direction. The matter resolves itself into a question of their respective powers of the combatants. End of quote, back to Sowell. Although Marx seems to have a purely bargaining power theory of wages, the possible range of wages is limited by the customary standard of living as a floor, and by a ceiling representing wages high enough to threaten the existence of capitalism itself. The quote, oscillation of wages is penned within limits satisfactory to capitalist exploitation, unquote, back to Sowell. It has been claimed that Marx's increasing misery theory is logically inconsistent with his theory of a falling rate of profit. Obviously, if one dichotomizes output into wage income and property income, both cannot fall simultaneously unless absolute output declines. But here again, Marx's theory must be understood in Marx's unique terms. He divides output three ways: into wage income, which he calls variable capital, property income, which he calls surplus value, and replacement of depreciated machinery and raw materials, etc., which he calls constant capital. There's nothing to prevent the proportions of the first two from being less in later periods than in early periods, with a secular rise in the proportion of the third. In the Marxian theory, it is the rate of profit which tends to decline, while the mass increases, and the share of labor that falls rather than ordinary real wages. Section 4. The non-economic dimension of misery. The non-economic aspect of increasing misery rests on Marx's philosophical approach and his underlying conception of man. The Marxian model of analysis follows the Hegelian dialectical approach insofar as it tends to analyze things not simply as they are, but as they are potentially. This applies not only to social and economic systems, but also to man in general and the worker in particular. Thus, the extent to which the worker is given scope for unfolding his inner potentialities is a vital part, if not the vital part, of his well-being. To Marx. Work, to Marx, is precisely the instrumentality of this realization of his potentiality by the individual, as well as by mankind. Work is not a mere disutility to be endured for the sake of satisfying material human wants, in which case material production would then be the measure of absolute or relative well-being. On the contrary, work is itself, quote, life's prime want, unquote, back to Sowell, because it contributes to the development of the individual. This is dialectical development. Quote, caterpillar grows into a bigger caterpillar. It develops into a butterfly, unquote, back to Sowell. Not so the worker under capitalism. Quote, if the silkworm were to spin in order to continue its existence as a caterpillar, it would be a complete wage worker. End of quote. Back to Sowell. Yet work can be an end in itself, and its performance a satisfaction. Quote, Milton produced Paradise Lost for the same reason that a silkworm produces silk. It was an activity of his nature. Unquote. Back to Sowell. Marx was annoyed at economists like Adam Smith, who treated the expenditure of labor time, quote, as the mere sacrifice of rest, freedom, and happiness, not as at the same time the normal activity of living beings, unquote. Back to Sowell. World history for Marx represents the creation of man by human labor. Under capitalism, Marx argues, work no longer fulfills its vital role in the lives of people. The division of labor under capitalism, quote, attacks the individual at the very roots of his life, unquote. It converts the worker into a crippled monstrosity by developing his manual dexterity in a narrow detail, quote, at the expense of a world of productive capabilities and instincts, just as in the states of La Plata, they butcher a whole feast for the sake of his hide or his tallow, end of quote. What is more relevant to the present question, Marx declares that this must grow worse over time under capitalism. The same methods which increase productivity are methods which, quote, mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man and estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor processes in the same proportion as science is incorporated in it as an independent power. End of quote. This is a vital part of the picture which leads Marx directly to the conclusion that, quote, in proportion as capital accumulates, the lot of the laborer, be his payment high or low, must grow worse. End of quote. Back to Sowell. Although this aspect of well-being, or lack of well-being, is often overlooked by his interpreters, it was supremely important to Marx himself. He described it as, quote, a question of life or death, unquote, that the worker under capitalism, quote, crippled by lifelong repetition of one and the same trivial operation, and thus reduced to the mere fragment of a man, end of quote, be replaced by, quote, the fully developed individual to whom the different social functions he performs are but so many modes of giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers, end of quote. Section 5, Concluding Remarks. Because Marx saw a tendency for industry to become more capital intensive, he postulated a secular decline in the proportion of outlays on wages, what he called variable capital, to outlays on plant and equipment, what he called constant capital, and property incomes, what he calls consumer value, a surplus value rather, or a fall in wages, as he terms it. This might conceivably go so far as to deprive the workers of any increase in their standard of living, but whether it would go that far depended upon the relative bargaining power of capital and labor, the latter resisting the fall in wages through trade unions, etc. If the fall could be arrested at any point above the previously existing subsistence level, then the lower wages would represent an increased quantity of goods, although the value of these goods would be less. That is, the workers would be spending less of their day producing their own livelihood and more of it producing surplus value for the capitalists. A more important question to Marx than the movement of wages, even in relative terms, was the question of the self-realization of men through their practical physical and mental exertions. Man, as the sum total of his potentialities, is only successively revealed through the exercise of his faculties. Under capitalism, Marx argues, the worker, quote, does not fulfill himself in his work, but denies himself, and has a feeling of misery, end of quote, back to Sowell. This misery becomes progressively worse with the growth of capitalism as the worker is increasingly estranged, quote, from the intellectual potentialities of the labor process. End of quote, back to Sowell. For Marx, this is a fundamental deprivation which cannot be remedied by higher wages. The end.